James Bowery, June 16 on Facebook. Okay, you're about to get my 6 Sigma, out there, working hypothesis about human ecology and, in particular, blacks, that has formed over the course of 40 years living in a variety of urban and rural areas. You really should just try to think of me as an alien ecologist visiting your planet, reporting on what he sees. If you are among the victims of functional brain damage induced by the supremacist theocracy's ideology, you will, of course, trot out the diagnosis of demon possession, racism. I'm sorry this has happened to you. Your humanity has been so degraded that you are no longer free to think about some of the most salient aspects of life. You really need to cut the strings attached to your cognitive body, primarily your deeper brain structures associated with emotive memories that have been imprinted by motion pictures bypassing your critical faculties, creating false, uncontextualized memories. Here's an example of your functional brain damage. You understand that scientists are skeptical, hence are capable of entertaining, as thought experiments, hypotheses not widely adopted. This is essential to discovery. Entertain this. It may be incorrect that races are sufficiently equal in average cognitive characteristics that social policy can equalize those averages for all practical purposes. I know. It scares you to go there. Indeed, you feel the fires of the Holocaust welling up from the abyss upon this thought. But, remember, this is merely a thought experiment, not a working hypothesis you are to apply. We'll ignore for the moment this feeling may be just _1_ of the strings, imprinted by 200+ Holocaust movies out of Hollywood compared to 0 Holodomor movies out of Hollywood. On this, a mere possibility that your working hypothesis, indeed your religion feelings, may be wrong. Consider the consequences of attributing racism to a society that does not result in equal average outcomes between racial groups, despite passing laws directly addressing racial discrimination, etc. Since the government enforces laws specifically favoring racial groups suffering from racism, other racial groups will be disfavored by the enforced reallocation of society's resources. Those so disfavored will, if they perceive this merely hypothetical, counterfactual reality, view the government as unfair. In reaction, the powerful, and those aligned with the powerful, will view these perceptive victims with contempt as racist. Since contempt is the luxury of insular power and hate is the reaction of the powerless, there will arise in the land hate, which will become an emotion subject to criminal punishment. As there can be no resolution to this situation, the contempt and hate will grow without bounds. Now, I understand that this little FB post isn't going to undo a lifetime of motion picture virtual reality simulation that bypassed your critical faculties to create false emotional memories embedded deep in your amygdala. To free yourself will require more than mere abstract intellectual consideration of possibilities, even if backed up by entire libraries of statistics. I get it. You're damaged. That's real. The damage is done. You need to mourn the loss of decades of life enriched by freedom to think and see reality through your own eyes, to relate to people as they are as you are, in natural human relations so you might recover the value of what's left of your life. There is no one to help you, not mental health professionals, not clergy, not even support groups. I'm sorry for you. You probably can't go further in this journey with me. For that I'm truly sorry for both of us. For those that can continue, here's the idea that I've called the genetic omnidominance hypothesis, to, in a backhanded way, make a sarcastic comment on the way our society has elevated the black man to replace our image of God. It is also a backhanded swipe at Richard Dawkins who, once he had written, The Extended Phenotype, the basis of much of what follows, seemed to abandon science for the rest of his life in an attack on belief in God in service of his own quasi-religious devotion to atheism. As a rule, hybrids do not represent the form exactly intermediate between the parental strains. Those traits that pass into hybrid association entirely or almost entirely unchanged, thus themselves representing the traits of the hybrid, are termed dominating, and those that become latent in the association, recessive. Gregor Mendel 1865, mutations are most frequently in the direction of inactivation and that for physiological reasons inactivation should generally behave as recessive. Sewall Wright 1929, if two beavers working on the same dam have different genes for dam height, the resulting extended phenotype will reflect the interaction between genes, in the same way as bodies reflect the gene interactions. There could be extended genetic analogues of epistasis, of modifier genes, even of dominance and recessiveness. Richard Dawkins 1982, freedom is the ability to express self-interest. Oppression is the inability to express self-interest. Slavery is the compulsion to express other interest. Dominance acquires freedom by taking it from others, resulting in oppression if not slavery. To the extent that phenotypes extend outside the bodies within which their genes reside, as described by Dawkins, genetic dominance including as modifier genes and epistasis, as well as simple dominance described by Mendel, has social implications. To the extent that mutations tend to be recessive, as described by Wright, those social implications are the oppression and slavery of recently evolved populations by older populations when they come into intimate contact through ecological mixing. This is the essence of hypothesis of genetic omnidominance, the God hypothesis. The extended phenotype, the aspect of the genetic omnidominance hypothesis that is most difficult to accept, is based on a new and revolutionary way of viewing the relationship between genes and phenotypes within ecological systems christened by Richard Dawkins, the extended phenotype. Here is a brief introduction to the concept from the book, The Extended Phenotype, by Richard Dawkins, of which he says, "It doesn't matter if you never read anything else of mine, please at least read this." Begin quote of Dawkins from The Extended Phenotype. Let us briefly take stock of where we have reached in our outward march. The phenotypic expression of a gene can extend outside the cell in which the genes exert their immediate biochemical influence, to affect gross features of a whole multicellular body. This is commonplace, and we are conventionally used to the idea of a gene's phenotypic expression being extended this far. In the previous chapter we took the small further step of extending the phenotype to artifacts, built by individual behavior which is subject to genetic variation, for instance caddis houses. Next we saw that an extended phenotype can be built under the joint influence of genes in more than one individual body. Beaver dams and termite mounds are collectively built by the behavioral efforts of more than one individual. A genetic mutation in one individual beaver could show itself in phenotypic change in the shared success of replication of the new gene. Natural selection would act, positively or negatively, to change the probability of similar artifacts existing in the future. The gene's extended phenotypic effect, say an increase in the height of the dam, affects its chances of survival in precisely the same sense as in the case of a gene with normal phenotypic effect, such as an increase in the length of the tail. The fact that the dam is the shared product of the building behavior of several beavers does not alter the principle. Genes that tend to make beavers build high dams will themselves, on average, tend to reap the benefits or costs of high dams, even though every dam may be jointly built by several beavers. If two beavers working on the same dam have different genes for dam height, the resulting extended phenotype will reflect the interaction between the genes, in the same way as bodies reflect the gene interactions. There could be extended genetic analogues of epistasis, of modifier genes, even of dominance and recessiveness. End quote of Dawkins from The Extended Phenotype, and thus we see Dawkins, himself, anticipated one of the two key concepts that undergird the hypothesis of genetic omnidominance, unifying Mendelian dominance, epistasis and extended phenotypics, just as I have already outlined in the God hypothesis above. The key concept that he misses is actually relatively straightforward once one understands the fundamental role the competition for expression plays in evolution. A gradient of decreasing dominance from the interior to the periphery of the ecological range, giving rise to greater God in the interior than toward the periphery. Parasitic castration, a genetic omnidominant phenotype that appears frequently throughout nearly all ecosystems is called parasitic castration by ethologists. In parasitic castration, the parasite diverts resources, closely linked to the host's reproductive behavior, to the general propagation of the parasite's genes. In the most primitive cases, this starts with the parasite actually eating the gonads of the host male, mechanical castration via tissue consumption. This is quite common as these tissues are not vital for the survival of the individual host and provide a meal for the parasite. But the resources offered by the meal are trivial compared to what comes long after the gonads have been consumed, in the form of resources that would otherwise go to mating investments and nurturing of the host's offspring that would result from such mating investments. Despite the rather obvious and overwhelming long-term benefits of host castration to parasites, parasitologists have historically been reluctant to face, squarely, the rather disturbing, from a host's perspective, idea that there may be more to parasitic castration than a single meal. From Richard Dawkins, The Extended Phenotype, Chapter, Host Phenotypes of Parasite Genes, for instance, an important review of parasitic castration in Crustacea, Reinhard 1956, is packed with detailed information and speculation on the precise physiological routes by which parasites castrate their hosts, but is almost devoid of discussion on why they might have been selected to do so, or whether, instead, castration is simply a fortuitous byproduct of parasitization. However, direct gonadal consumption is not even necessary for the achievement of the big long-term payoff resulting from diversion of reproductive resources. The chemical castration that is used as criminal punishment for rapists is far more direct, even though it does not require mechanical excision of gonads, and ethologists such as Baudouin have pointed to cases in which parasites achieve host castration by synthesis of host hormones, not even bothering to consume the gonadal tissues. With such overwhelming evidence that parasitic castration is a highly specific adaptation, not dependent on the immediate nutritional value of the gonads, one can only speculate on the possibility that the thesis presented in Mind Control and the God Hypothesis may be operative among ethologists described by Dawkins in the preceding passage. The Amygdala and parasitic castration key structure in human fertility, particularly male fertility, is the amygdala, which dramatically reduces in size upon castration. According to Malsbury and McKay, the amygdala shrinkage can be about 25% within 8 weeks of castration. Malsbury, C.W. and K. McKay. Neurotrophic effects of testosterone on the medial nucleus of the amygdala in adult male rats. J. Neuroendocrinology, 1994, 657–69. Although reduction in size is not the only way this brain structure may be reprogrammed to affect parasitic castration, it is a possible observable. Furthermore, since large changes in human migration patterns have occurred in living memory, there should be plenty of intact amygdala specimens that can be correlated with their genotype, as well as changes in the environmental genotypes that may impose extended phenotypic parasitic castration. Among the biological pathogens that are candidates are viruses, which are found with increasing frequency and diversity as human diversity is enforced at every opportunity by governments over recessive demographies. Not only should retroviruses related to HIV, which is known to damage the amygdala and surrounding tissues, be looked into, but also the more mundane neural pathogens such as human herpes virus, which has also been linked to amygdala damage. Emotive memes as human pheromones discussed above. It is plausible that territorial competition between males has resulted in a variety of mechanisms for manipulating the amygdalae of rivals via extended phenotypics. The amygdala is a key structure in the processes of smell. One of the more plausible neurochemical routes for such genetic omnidominant expression would be the emission of olfactory signals. Pheromones are among the more evolutionarily sophisticated mechanisms by which such extended phenotypic manipulation might occur. In humans, smell has been shown to play some role in sexual attractiveness, with some studies indicating a feminine ability to discriminate between MHC genotypes with consequences for sexual attractiveness. It is natural to presume, therefore, that pheromones play a similar role in humans. However, Jacobson's organ, and the associated structures for the neurochemical pathways involving pheromones are, in humans, atrophied compared to their counterparts in other animals. This leads one to suspect that a new mechanism has arisen with humans that largely displaces the role played by pheromones in other animals. A clue as to what this new mechanism might be can be found in the other, primary, function of the amygdala, and that is in the storage of emotive memory. In human evolution, memes, replicators that rely on human memory as their raw material, are transmitted between humans with sophistication that rivals and indeed, in many areas, easily surpasses the sophistication of pheromones. Furthermore, such enormous reliance on memes for intraspecific communication seems as unique to humans as is the vestigial nature of structures for pheromones. It is plausible, therefore, that with the development of neurochemical pathways for memes, particularly memes associated with intense emotions, humans lost many of the evolutionary pressures that maintain the pheromone-specific neurochemical pathways in other animals. Spatial structure in populations has been shown by Oliphant, M. 1994. Evolving Cooperation in the Non-Iterated Prisoner's Dilemma, The Importance of Spatial Organization. In Brooks, R. and Mays, P. eds. Proceedings of the Fourth Artificial Life Workshop. pp. 349–352 MIT Press, Cambridge, Massachusetts, to be sufficient to evolve mimetic capability in kin-based societies. However, in non-kin environments, such as those predicted by the genetic omnidominance hypothesis to produce intraspecific parasitic castration, one should expect to find sociarian communication progressively degenerating as evolutionary pressure drives the expression of increasingly sophisticated means of transmitting emotive memes that take up residence as emotive memories in the amygdala of rivals, thereby reducing their reproductive competence. Prisoner rape. The first night I was approached by 3 men. 2 of them were about my size and the third was about 9 kilos and 15 cms smaller. They asked who I was and what I was in for. I told them, and then one of them asked if I had ever been fucked. I said, no, and I wasn't planning on it. He said, we're going to fuck you. I was filled with fear like I had never felt before. I swung at him with a left hook, and as he blocked it his partner swung and hit me in the face, knocking me to the floor. One of them grabbed me by the hair and slammed my face into the concrete, knocking me out. When I woke I was on my stomach. My pants had been pulled off. My legs were spread wide apart, with one guy sitting on each leg and the other guy laying on my back. The guy on top was slapping me awake and said, I want you to feel this. Example of imprinting an emotive memory on the amygdala of a young man. Excerpted from Fear or Favor? Sexual Assault of Young Prisoners, by David Heilpenguchoni's own Penthouse magazine carried an article in its August 1995 issue titled, Prisoner Rape. Every Man's Greatest Fear, which documents the pervasive terror of the government experienced by the very men who pay the most taxes. Being brutally feminized by the government that has taken on the role of protector and provider for much of the female population is a fundamental shift in gender relations, but like virtually all intraspecific parasitic castration, it has hit males with the least genetic omnidominance hardest. According to a quote of a black prisoner in the book No Escape, Male Rape in U.S. Prisons by Joanne Mariner of the Human Rights Watch. The belief that all or most white men are effete or gay is very prevalent. According to Jim Hogshire, author of You Are Going to Prison, Prisoner Rape, especially Gang Rape, is almost exclusively a black-on-white occurrence. More than 90% of prison rapists are black, and the instance of a white raping a black is rarest of all. Most victims are young and white. What Hogshire fails to mention, but which is often mentioned in the literature, is that the market for sex slaves in the prison system, like the market for Russian sex slaves in Israel, targets young blonde and red-haired people most heavily, in this case males, for adopting the feminine sexual role. Documents from Stop Prisoner Rape discuss the distinction between non-Mediterranean European cultures and Mediterranean European cultures when it comes to retaining or abrogating male sexual identity in prisoner rape, with Mediterranean males more likely to retain their male sexual identity and non-Mediterranean European males more likely to go punk, i.e., take on a feminine identity. Although the Home Box Office Network has carried a fictional series called Oz, which attempts to portray this differently, that Jews and Italians are targeted more than are Protestant heritage males, one must recall that the motion picture industry continues to be dominated by people of Mediterranean extraction. The fact that many recessive males turn to gang formation should be no surprise, since much of the immunity to prisoner gang rape enjoyed by Mediterranean and black males derives from their criminal gang organizations whose reach extends into the prison system. However, the recessive male gangs are under the additional burden of being uniquely demonized by the government and political hierarchy as Nazi. Therefore, any attempts to form effective self-protection groups are more vigorously attacked by prison officials than are similar attempts by other ethnicities. It should be no surprise that black men are killed by these would-be Nazis at a higher frequency than are the Nazis killed by black men, despite the fact that it results in life imprisonment for the Nazi, whereas prisoner gang rape results in far lesser punishments in those exceedingly rare cases where it is reported, assuming prosecution is successful. This situation, in which the government selectively targets recessive males for parasitic castration via prisoner gang rape and high rates of taxation in support of women's material and physical security, including their children who are sired by more genetically dominant men, is a relatively recent innovation outside of societies with much greater harem sizes and corresponding genetic omnidominance. It may well reflect extended phenotypic omnidominance at the level of the overall culture and its governance as it has become infused with individuals of said omnidominance. Finally, a casual walk through any video store, counting the phenotypes, demonstrates that Hollywood, where the decision-makers are more God than the population among whom they have traditionally operated, generally portrays recessive phenotypes as secondary sexual characteristics of females. While some have argued that within a given demography, females have somewhat less pigmentation than males, the extremes to which this has been exaggerated in media may be the most intensive form of parasitic castration manifest in the daily life of the West. Mind control when mental processes, particularly those concerning the genetics of kin identification and reproduction, are up for grabs. The God hypothesis predicts genetic omnidominance will override the mental processes of individuals of lesser God-producing behavior that seems bizarre if one does not consider the externality of the genes being served by said behavior. For example, arguing in good faith about genetics with those subject to the logical fallacies of political correctness is frequently akin to arguing with the bee in the following passage from The Extended Phenotype by Richard Dawkins, chapter titled Host Phenotypes of Parasite Genes. Many fascinating examples of parasites manipulating the behavior of their hosts can be given. For nematomorph larvae, who need to break out of their insect hosts and get into water where they live as adults, a major difficulty in the parasite's life is the return to water. It is, therefore, of particular interest that the parasite appears to affect the behavior of its host, and encourages it to return to water. The mechanism by which this is achieved is obscure, but there are sufficient isolated reports to certify that the parasite does influence its host, and often suicidally for the host. One of the more dramatic reports describes an infected bee flying over a pool and, when about 6 feet over it, diving straight into the water. Immediately on impact the Gordian worm burst out and swam into the water, the maimed bee being left to die. Kroll 1966. We can rest assured the bee was not thinking, I must atone for the abuses to which my species' immune system has put the poor little nematomorph larva throughout our history of coevolution together. Therefore, with full knowledge and forethought, I now die for my little friend inside, and I feel so good about myself. Despite how impressive our little parable of the politically correct bee is. However, when the mental processes are as complex as those supported by human nervous systems, the God influences of parasite genes may be masked in entire academic and theological disciplines with libraries filled with the scholarly works of the generations. The fact that such genetically suicidal behavior is almost entirely on behalf of more God gene pools, with the most extremes of political correctness, exhibited by the most recessive gene pools ecologically furthest from human origin. In places like Stockholm, Sweden, one of the last benefactors of Zimbabwe's Mugabe regime to withhold its enormous monetary gifts during Zimbabwe's extended low-level war against white farmers, or Seattle, Washington, the Gates Foundation gives more to benefit sub-Saharan African populations than any other, expressing altruism toward places closest to human origin, is something directly predicted by the God hypothesis. Likewise, it is unsurprising when populations not so far from human origins are less charitable toward those populations even nearer to human origins. Take, for example, this quote, "Ours is one continued struggle against degradation sought to be inflicted upon us by the European, who desire to degrade us to the level of the raw Kafir, whose occupation is hunting and whose sole ambition is to collect a certain number of cattle to buy a wife with, and then pass his life in indolence and nakedness." Mahatma Gandhi collected works 2p. 74. The dramatic example of the internal parasite leaves some wondering how genes external to a body might lead to the control of that body's nervous system. All further transcribed from the introduction of the chapter, Host Phenotypes of Parasite Genes. This chapter will develop 2 further ideas. One is that phenotypes that extend outside the body do not have to be inanimate artifacts, they can themselves be built of living tissue. The other idea is that whenever there are shared, genetic influences on an extended phenotype, the shared influences may be in conflict with each other rather than cooperative. The relationships we shall be concerned with are those of parasites and their hosts. I shall show that it is logically sensible to regard parasite genes as having phenotypic expression in host bodies and behavior. And now the closing of that chapter, but we have not yet reached the end of our continuum of proximity. Not all parasites live physically inside their hosts. They may even seldom come into contact with their hosts. A cuckoo is a parasite in very much the same way as a fluke. Both are whole organism parasites rather than tissue parasites or cell parasites. If fluke genes can be said to have phenotypic expression in a snail's body, there is no sensible reason why cuckoo genes should not be said to have phenotypic expression in a reed warbler's body. The difference is a practical one, and a rather smaller one than the difference between, say, a cellular parasite and a tissue parasite. The practical difference is that the cuckoo does not live inside the reed warbler's body, so has less opportunity for manipulating the host's internal biochemistry. It has to rely on other media for its manipulation, for instance sound waves and light waves. As discussed in Chapter 4, it uses a supernormally bright gape to inject its control into the reed warbler's nervous system via the eyes. It uses an especially loud begging cry to control the reed warbler's nervous system via the ears. Cuckoo genes, in exerting their developmental power over host phenotypes, have to rely on action at a distance. And finally, scholars of revolutions may find the following passage from Chapter 4, Arms Races and Manipulation, particularly interesting. Several species of ant have no workers of their own. The queens invade nests of other species, dispose of the host queen, and use the host workers to bring up their own reproductive young. The method of disposing of the queen varies. In some species, such as the descriptively named Bothriomyrmex regicitus and B. decapitans, the parasite queen rides about on the back of the host queen and then, in Wilson's 1971 delightful description, begins the one act for which she is uniquely specialized, slowly cutting off the head of her victim. p. 363 Monomorium Sanchi achieves the same result by more subtle means. The host workers have weapons wielded by strong muscles, and nerves attached to the muscles. Why should the parasite queen exert her own jaws if she can subvert the nervous systems controlling the numerous jaws of the host workers? It does not seem to be known how she achieves it, but she does. The host workers kill their own mother and adopt the usurper. A chemical secreted by the parasite queen seems the likely weapon, in which case it might be labeled a pheromone, but it is probably more illuminating to think of it as a formidably powerful drug. In line with this interpretation, Wilson 1971, p. 413, writes of symphylic substances as being more than just elementary nutritive substances or even analogues of the natural host pheromones. Several authors have spoken of a narcotizing effect of symphylic substances. Wilson also uses the word intoxicant, and quotes a case in which worker ants under the influence of such a substance become temporarily disoriented and less sure of their footing. Those who have never been brainwashed or addicted to a drug find it hard to understand their fellow men who are driven by such compulsions. In the same naive way we cannot understand a host birds being compelled to feed an absurdly oversized cuckoo, or worker ants wantonly murdering the only being in the whole world that is vital to their genetic success. But such subjective feelings are misleading, even where the relatively crude achievements of human pharmacology are concerned. With natural selection working on the problem, who would be so presumptuous as to guess what feats of mind control might not be achieved? When we see words such as prejudice and discrimination used in morally pejorative and even medically diagnostic ways that are otherwise indistinguishable from knowledge, wisdom, and discernment, particularly in the areas of thought about genes, who would be so presumptuous as to assert no genetic interests are at work generating emotional confusion of clear-headedness. Finally, Dawkins completes this paragraph on mind control with a warning: do not expect to see animals always behaving in such a way as to maximize their own inclusive fitness. Losers in an arms race, genetic omni-recessives, JAB, may behave in some very odd ways indeed. If they appear disoriented and unsure of their footing, this may be only the beginning.